John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, into what outwardly looked like an ordinary working-class American family. He was the only son of John Stanley Gacy and Marion Robinson, and the second of three children. His two sisters described him as a boy who longed for affection but often found himself at odds with his father. From the beginning, his life was marked by contradictions that would later mirror the dual identities he maintained as both a beloved community figure and a predator lurking in the shadows. His father, a World War I veteran and an auto repair machinist, was an alcoholic with violent temper. He drank heavily and frequently lashed out at his wife and children. To John, the abuse was both physical and psychological. He endured constant criticism, beatings, and belittlement. His father's words left scars that were deeper than the bruises. He called his son weak, compared him unfavorably to other boys, and instilled in him a sense of inadequacy that never went away. Gacy's mother, Marion, tried to shield her son from the violence, but her protection could never outweigh the dominance of his father's wrath. That imbalance of love and cruelty would come to define much of Gacy's view of family and relationships. As a child, Gacy suffered from health problems that only reinforced his sense of alienation. He was overweight, prone to fainting spells, and later discovered to have a congenital heart condition. These issues limited his ability to participate in sports and other activities that might have earned his father's approval. Instead of excelling physically, he became known for his friendliness and eagerness to please. He wanted desperately to be liked, and in many ways, he was. Teachers and neighbors described him as well-mannered and polite. But behind that behavior lingered the constant sting of rejection at home. In his teenage years, Gacy began grappling with feelings he could not openly express. He felt different, and in a conservative 1950s household, those feelings had no place for discussion. The lack of acceptance at home pushed him to search for belonging elsewhere. He dropped out of high school before graduating, frustrated by his strained relationship with his father and his inability to meet the standards set before him. Restless and looking for escape, he left Chicago for Las Vegas, where he found work in a mortuary. There, he was exposed to the world of death in a way few teenagers ever are. For several months, he lived at the funeral home, slept in the embalming room, and assisted with mortuary duties. Later, he admitted to an incident where he lay beside a deceased teenage boy's body, caressing it, though he quickly fled from the experience. It was an ominous foreshadowing of the twisted impulses that would later drive him. Eventually, Gacy returned to Chicago and sought a more conventional life. He enrolled at Northwestern Business College and graduated in 1963. That same year, he married Marlyn Myers, the daughter of a wealthy fast food franchise owner. The marriage seemed to offer him a new beginning, one that included respectability, stability, and family life. The couple moved to Waterloo, Iowa, where Gacy managed several Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants owned by his father-in-law. Outwardly, he was a young businessman on the rise. Within the community, he was active in the JCs, a civic organization that prided itself on leadership and volunteerism. He gained a reputation for being ambitious, charming, and dedicated to his work. Behind closed doors, however, cracks were already forming. Gacy's personal life was troubled by a growing attraction to teenage boys. In 1968, his carefully constructed image collapsed when he was charged with sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 10 years at the Iowa State Men's Reformatory. The revelation shocked the community, and his wife immediately filed for divorce, severing all ties with him. For the first time, the world saw the duality of John Wayne Gacy, the outwardly charming, hardworking family man, and the predator who preyed on the vulnerable. Prison was supposed to be a turning point, but instead, it became an intermission. Though he was sentenced to a decade, Gacy served only 18 months before being paroled in 1970 for good behavior. By then, he had mastered the art of manipulation, impressing prison officials with his work ethic and willingness to follow the rules. Once released, he returned to Chicago and tried once again to rebuild his life. With the help of his mother, he purchased a house in the Norwood Park Township, a quiet suburb that would later become infamous as the scene of his crimes. In 1971, Gacy remarried. His second wife, Carol Hoff, was a high school acquaintance who hoped to find stability with him. Together, they moved into the modest house on Somerdale Avenue, which would one day be described as a house of horrors. To his neighbors, Gacy appeared industrious and friendly. He started a successful construction business, hosted elaborate block parties, and even dressed as a clown for children's hospitals, parades, and birthday parties. He created two characters, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, and in costume he entertained crowds with jokes, balloon animals, and an infectious smile. The image of the friendly clown would become one of the most chilling aspects of his legacy, a mask of joy hiding a reality of unimaginable cruelty. By day, Gacy was a model citizen, a contractor who hired young men for work, a volunteer who gave back to the community, a man who seemed to put his troubled past behind him. By night, however, his darker impulses resurfaced. His second marriage deteriorated under the weight of his secret life. Carol grew suspicious of his relationships with teenage boys and eventually divorced him in 1976. Gacy's double life was now fully entrenched. What made John Wayne Gacy's story so terrifying was not just the brutality of his crimes, but the way he disguised them beneath an ordinary mask. He was a neighbor who lent tools, the man who shook hands at community events, the clown who made children laugh. To the outside world, he was cheerful, dependable, and generous. To those who entered his orbit and never returned, he was something else entirely. In this first chapter of his life, the pattern had already been set. A childhood filled with abuse and inadequacy, a young adulthood punctuated by troubling behaviors, a failed marriage, a conviction for sexual assault, and then a reinvention that convinced an entire community he was safe to trust. Yet beneath the smiling makeup and polite demeanor, the seeds of violence had already been planted. The man known as Pogo the Clown was preparing to commit crimes that would horrify the nation and permanently etch his name into the darkest chapters of American true crime. This duality, the public mask of charm and the hidden reality of predation, would be central to understanding how John Wayne Gacy evaded suspicion for so long. It was not that he lived two separate lives. It was that he made the mask and the monster coexist in the same house, on the same street, in the same man. The world had yet to discover just how dangerous that combination would become. By the mid-1970s, John Wayne Gacy had settled into what looked like the life of a successful suburban businessman. On the outside, he was everything a community might want in a neighbor. He was industrious, sociable, and generous with his time. He owned a modest but comfortable home at 8213 Somerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township, a quiet suburb of Chicago. The house stood on a well-kept lawn, its interior decorated with trophies, pictures, and signs of middle-class prosperity. To visitors, it seemed like the home of a man who had overcome his troubles and was now living a respectable life. In reality, it was becoming the center of a nightmare that would not be discovered until years later. Gacy's life as a community man revolved around the idea of appearances. He knew how to charm people, how to make them feel comfortable, and how to project the image of reliability. His construction business, PDM Contractors, short for painting, decorating, and maintenance, was one of the most visible parts of that image. The company gave him a legitimate role in the community and access to a steady stream of young workers. Many of these workers were teenagers and young men looking for part-time jobs or construction experience. Gacy's willingness to hire them not only bolstered his reputation as a businessman, but also gave him easy access to potential victims. Business was good. Gacy landed contracts with local companies, politicians, and even state offices. He frequently boasted about his success, telling friends and neighbors how many projects he was juggling or how much work his company had secured. But PDM was not just a source of income. It was a tool that fed his darker compulsions. Through it, he gained the trust of young men whom he could lure into his orbit with promises of employment and steady wages. In the guise of a mentor and employer, he identified those who seemed the most vulnerable, runaways, boys estranged from their families, or teens eager to earn money quickly. Many of these young men entered his home under the pretense of job interviews, parties, or casual social visits, unaware that they would never leave alive. The mask of respectability extended beyond his work. Gacy was deeply involved in civic life. He became known for throwing lavish neighborhood parties, sometimes with hundreds of guests. He barbecued, served drinks, and mingled effortlessly, giving the impression of a man who loved to entertain and bring people together. These parties became so popular that even local politicians attended. The fact that influential figures felt comfortable at his gatherings bolstered his image as a man of good standing. It was an effective cover. No one could imagine that the host of such well-attended events was hiding dozens of corpses beneath his very floorboards. Perhaps the most chilling part of his community involvement was his persona as a clown. Gacy crafted two characters, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, and appeared at parades, fundraisers, hospitals, and children's parties dressed in full makeup and costume. To many, it seemed like a harmless hobby, a way for him to give back to the community and bring joy to children. In retrospect, however, the image of the clown became symbolic of the grotesque double life he was leading. The exaggerated smile painted across his face hid the reality of the predator beneath. For children, he was a man who twisted balloons into animals. For his victims, he was a man who twisted their trust into terror. At home, his marriage to Carol Hoff was unraveling. Carol had moved into the Somerdale Avenue house with her two daughters from a previous marriage. At first, life with Gacy seemed stable. He provided for the family, worked hard, and involved himself in community activities. But Carol soon began to notice unsettling aspects of her husband's behavior. He spent an unusual amount of time with young men, and seemed to prefer their company over that of adults his own age. She found magazines depicting homosexual pornography and grew increasingly disturbed by his frequent late-night absences. By 1975, their relationship was strained beyond repair. Carol confronted him about his sexuality, and Gacy admitted he was bisexual. More disturbingly, she began to suspect something darker about his activities. Neighbors occasionally reported foul smells coming from the crawl space beneath the house. Gacy explained the odor away, blaming it on moisture problems or old sewer pipes. Carol accepted the explanation at first, but unease lingered. Eventually, in 1976, she filed for divorce, unable to reconcile the respectable image her husband projected with the disturbing reality of his habits. After the divorce, Gacy lived alone in the house, free from scrutiny within his own walls. The end of his marriage removed one of the few restraints on his private life. He now had complete control of the home, and the crawl space beneath it became the burial ground for most of his victims. The duality of his life became even more pronounced. Outwardly a successful businessman and community volunteer, inwardly a man whose impulses had escalated into a systematic pattern of abduction, assault, and murder. What made Gacy so effective at evading suspicion was his ability to wear his mask convincingly. Neighbors described him as jovial and approachable, someone who lent tools or offered to plow snow in the winter. To colleagues, he was a hard worker and a man who understood business. To local leaders, he was an asset to the community, a reliable supporter who showed up at fundraisers and lent a hand when needed. Even when rumors circulated about his interest in young men, they were dismissed as eccentricities rather than red flags. His ability to manipulate perceptions extended to law enforcement as well. On more than one occasion, in the early 1970s, he was arrested or questioned about allegations of sexual assault. Yet charges were dropped, evidence dismissed, or cases overlooked. Each time, Gacy walked away with his reputation bruised but intact, using his connections and charm to explain away the allegations. These close calls only emboldened him. If the police could be convinced to look the other way, then surely no one would ever connect a respectable clown with the growing list of missing boys in the Chicago area. The contradictions in his life highlight why his story continues to fascinate and terrify. He was a man who lived in plain sight, his crimes hidden behind the facade of a helpful neighbor, a doting clown, and a successful businessman. The same hands that shook those of politicians and comforted children at parties also bound, strangled, and buried dozens of young men. His house became a symbol of that deception, outwardly an ordinary suburban home, inwardly a graveyard. By the late 1970s, the mask was beginning to slip, though few recognized it. The odor from the crawl space grew stronger. The whispers about missing boys became louder. The inconsistencies in Gacy's stories began to draw attention. Yet still, he maintained his cover. The community continued to see him as the man they thought they knew. Respectable, generous, dependable. But beneath that mask, the deadly predator was becoming bolder. certain that his charm and connections would keep the truth buried forever. It was only a matter of time before his two worlds collided. The respectable neighbor could not hide the predator indefinitely. The weight of crimes beneath his house, both literal and figurative, was building toward an inevitable revelation. And when that moment came, the shock would reverberate far beyond the quiet suburb of Norwood Park, capturing national attention and forever altering the image of what a friendly smile and a painted clown face could conceal. The disappearances began quietly, almost unnoticeably, like drops of water vanishing into a storm drain. In the early 1970s, Chicago was a bustling city filled with opportunities, but for young men searching for work or companionship, it could also be perilous. John Wayne Gacy knew this well, and he exploited every gap in trust, every ounce of youthful hope, and every layer of authority he had built for himself in the community. His construction business, PDM Contractors, became both a legitimate operation and a hunting ground. For boys eager to earn a few dollars, the offer of work seemed harmless. For those drifting without direction, a man with a stable job and fatherly charm seemed like someone to trust. Behind that trust, however, lay a predator who was refining his methods with chilling precision. The first known victim is believed to have been Timothy McCoy, a young man Gacy encountered in January 1972. According to Gacy's later confession, he claimed McCoy had tried to attack him with a knife, leading to a struggle that ended in the young man's death. But investigators and psychologists would later suggest that this story was an excuse, a way for Gacy to rationalize his first kill, masking the reality that he had discovered compulsion he could no longer control. McCoy's death ignited something in him. The thrill, the power, and the secrecy became a formula he would repeat over and over. After burying McCoy's body in the crawl space beneath his home, Gacy began to realize that his house could serve as both a prison and a graveyard. The pattern emerged slowly but steadily. Gacy would cruise through neighborhoods, bus stations, or shopping centers, often approaching teenagers with the promise of construction work. Sometimes he used his clown persona as a way to appear disarming, but most often he relied on the confidence of a middle-aged man offering employment. Once inside his home, he employed what became his infamous trick, the handcuff game. Pretending it was a magic trick, he would convince his victims to try on a pair of handcuffs. But unlike a magician, Gacy never offered the key. From that moment on, the boys were trapped, and the nightmare would unfold in a way that only he controlled. As the months turned into years, the list of the missing grew. Families across Chicago reported their sons disappearing with little trace, often after telling friends they had met a man offering work. Police, overwhelmed with runaway cases and lacking modern forensic technology, rarely connected the dots. In the 1970s, young men, especially teenagers, were often dismissed as runaways, assumed they left home voluntarily in search of adventure or independence. For Gacy, the societal blind spot became his shield. He targeted those least likely to be believed, those who slipped through cracks of a system ill-prepared to recognize the pattern of a serial predator. Inside his home on Somerdale Avenue, Gacy refined his gruesome rituals. Victims were often assaulted, tortured, and strangled before being buried in the crawl space. Over time, the smell beneath the house became so overwhelming that Gacy poured lime and spread concrete to mask it. Neighbors complained, and Gacy would dismiss their concerns, blaming the odor on plumbing issues or dead rodents. His charm and his reputation as a helpful community member allowed him to deflect suspicion. To the outside world, he was the friendly contractor and party clown. Behind closed doors, he was orchestrating one of the most horrifying killing sprees in American history. By 1974, Gacy's methods had become disturbingly efficient. He knew how to lure, how to manipulate, and how to dispose of his victims without raising alarm. He sometimes kept bodies in his bed for hours before burial, deriving satisfaction from control even after death. His crawl space, once empty, became a labyrinth of human remains, stacked layer upon layer, each grave dug with calculated precision. At times, when the space filled beyond capacity, he resorted to dumping bodies in the Des Plaines River. His house had transformed into a graveyard disguised as a suburban home. Despite the horror hidden beneath his floorboards, Gacy's public life flourished. He hosted parties, performed as Pogo the Clown, and volunteered in civic organizations. The contrast was staggering. A man capable of making children laugh in one moment and extinguishing the lives of teenagers in the next. This duality gave him confidence that he could continue indefinitely. Each successful cover-up, each police report that dismissed a missing boy as a runaway, reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. The disappearances began to ripple through Chicago's neighborhoods, leaving behind grieving families and unanswered questions. Parents searched desperately for their children, posting flyers and pleading for information. Yet time and again, they were told that their sons had probably left willingly. For families of working-class boys, often from broken homes, the dismissals cut even deeper. Their anguish was met with indifference, and their suspicions of foul play went unheard. The cruel irony was that the monster they feared was hiding in plain sight, shaking hands at community events and donning a clown suit for charity gatherings. Psychologists would later analyze Gacy's compulsion, pointing to a mix of sadistic desire, repressed sexuality, and psychological trauma rooted in his childhood. But in the moment, his crimes were not seen as the work of a developing serial killer. They were scattered across years, hidden behind a mask of normalcy and shielded by the cultural biases of the time. Gacy took full advantage, accelerating his killings with an almost mechanical regularity. Each victim represented another secret, another affirmation of power, and another reinforcement of the dark world he had created beneath his home. By the mid-1970s, Gacy's crawl space was filling faster than he could manage. He began to lose track of names, dates, and even the exact locations of some graves. To him, the victims blurred into one another, reduced in numbers rather than lives. The randomness of his choices made the crimes harder to trace. Some were strangers lured by work, others were boys he met at bus stations, and still others were acquaintances from his community. The lack of a single type of victim created confusion for investigators, further delaying the recognition of a serial predator in their midst. For nearly a decade, the disappearances continued, cloaked in indifference of a city stretched thin by crime and poverty. But beneath the surface, a storm was building. Families who had been ignored refused to stay silent. Investigators began to notice overlapping patterns, subtle details linking cases that had once seemed unrelated. And Gacy, growing bolder with each kill, would soon make the mistake that brought his hidden world crashing down. The disappearances had begun with quiet whispers, but soon they would lead to the most shocking discovery Chicago had ever seen, a house that contained the remains of dozens, and a man whose mask of respectability would be torn away forever. By the late 1970s, John Wayne Gacy's crimes had escalated to a point where his carefully constructed mask could no longer shield him. The crawl space beneath his house had become saturated with the bodies of young men. The odor was undeniable, and neighbors had grown increasingly suspicious. Yet still, Gacy continued to lure victims, confident in his ability to charm authorities and manipulate those around him. His arrogance would ultimately prove to be his undoing, and it began with the disappearance of a teenager named Robert Piest. Robert was a 15-year-old high school student, bright and ambitious, with dreams of becoming an architect. On December 11, 1978, after finishing his shift at a pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois, Robert mentioned to a coworker that he was going to meet a man about a potential job with a construction company. The man he referred to was John Wayne Gacy. That was the last time anyone saw Robert alive. When he failed to return home, his family immediately knew something was wrong. Unlike many of Gacy's previous victims, Robert was not a runaway, nor was he estranged from his family. His disappearance sparked immediate concern and set into motion an investigation that would unravel Gacy's web of lies. Robert's mother went directly to police, insisting that her son would never simply vanish. Investigators took the report seriously and quickly traced Robert's last known contact to Gacy. When they arrived at his home to question him, they found a man who was confident, talkative, and seemingly cooperative. Gacy insisted that he had not seen Robert that evening and dismissed any suggestion of involvement, but detectives noticed inconsistencies in his story. Moreover, Gacy's prior record for sexual assault of teenage boys in Iowa resurfaced in their background checks, making him more than just a casual suspect. The police began surveillance of Gacy, following his movements around the clock. What they observed was a man who oscillated between arrogance and nervousness. At times, he boasted openly about his connections in the community, dropping the names of politicians and insisting he was untouchable. At other times, he appeared erratic, driving aimlessly at night, drinking heavily, and behaving with increasing recklessness. Detectives noted these shifts carefully, building a profile of a man under immense psychological strain. While under surveillance, Gacy made crucial mistakes. He was observed handing small bags of marijuana to acquaintances, offering jobs to teenagers, and speaking carelessly about his past arrests. Detectives were granted search warrants, and when they entered his home, they discovered a series of alarming items. Police cataloged books on homosexuality, handcuffs, a 2x4 with holes drilled into the ends, driver's licenses belonging to young men who had gone missing, and a peculiar odor that seemed to emanate from beneath the house. Though the crawl space was noted, the first search did not immediately uncover the horrors it concealed. As the investigation intensified, Gacy grew more erratic. He began making confessions to friends and acquaintances, as if the weight of his crimes was finally crushing him. He told one friend that he had been judge, jury, and executioner to many young men. To another, he admitted that he had killed more than 24 people. These partial confessions, combined with the mounting evidence, gave detectives the momentum they needed. The turning point came on December 20th, 1978. Gacy, under mounting pressure, invited his attorneys to his home and made a full confession. He described in detail how he had lured young men to his house, tricked them into handcuffs, assaulted and strangled them, and then buried their bodies in the crawl space. He spoke of his first victim, of the methods he perfected, and of the times when the crawl space became so full that he resorted to disposing of bodies in the Des Plaines River. His attorneys were stunned by the scope of his admissions. The man they represented was confessing to crimes that placed him among the most prolific killers in American history. That same day, police conducted a second, more thorough search of the Somerdale Avenue home. This time, they entered the crawl space. The stench of decay was overwhelming, and soon shovels struck human remains. Investigators uncovered bones, decomposed bodies, and a labyrinth of graves beneath the floorboards. The sight was horrifying. The suburban house that had hosted parties and children's entertainers was now revealed as a burial ground. Each discovery added weight to reality that Gacy's home had been hiding the remains of dozens. News of the discovery spread quickly. The quiet Chicago suburb was overrun with reporters, onlookers, and grieving families desperate for answers. Police worked around the clock, excavating the crawl space and documenting every body. The sheer number of victims stunned even seasoned investigators. As the remains were exhumed one after another, it became clear that Gacy's killing spree had spanned years and had claimed far more victims than initially suspected. In total, 26 bodies were found beneath his house, with additional victims recovered from the river. The crawl space had become a twisted archive of his crimes, a physical record of the countless lives he had extinguished. Forensic teams faced the enormous challenge of identifying the remains. Many victims had been buried for years, reduced to skeletons that offered little for immediate recognition. Families who had long searched for missing sons now endured the agonizing process of waiting for identification through dental records, personal items, and later, DNA testing. Each name that emerged was a painful reminder of a life cut short, a dream destroyed, and a family left in torment. The discovery of the crawl space bodies confirmed what the community had long overlooked. The friendly neighbor, the respected contractor, the jovial clown. He had all been a disguise. Behind the painted smile was a man capable of some of the most grotesque acts of violence imaginable. The House of Horrors, as the media quickly dubbed it, became a symbol of deception, a reminder that evil can exist behind the most ordinary of doors. The Robert Pius case had been the thread that unraveled the entire tapestry of Gacy's lies. Without his disappearance and the persistence of his family, the truth might have remained buried indefinitely. But with the crawl space uncovered, Gacy's reign of terror was over. The discoveries horrified the public, captured national attention, and forced a reckoning with the failures that had allowed him to kill unchecked for so long. As investigators documented the scale of his crimes, one chilling detail became clear. Gacy had kept souvenirs of his victims, items such as jewelry, identification cards, and personal belongings. These trophies were not only a way for him to relive his crimes, but also a symbol of his control over the lives he had taken. They further painted the picture of a man who viewed his victims as disposable, reducing them to possessions stored in his home alongside the tools of his trade. The unearthing of the crawl space marked a turning point in American criminal history. It was not only one of the largest body recoveries in the nation's history, but also a moment that shattered the illusion of suburban safety. Parents across the country looked at their children differently, no longer able to trust the smiling faces of strangers. The house at 8213 Somerdale Avenue was not just a crime scene. It was a reminder that monsters often hide in plain sight. Gacy's arrest and the revelations from his home transformed him into a household name, synonymous with the darkest aspect of human behavior. Yet for the families of the victims, the discovery was less about infamy and more about devastating confirmation. The boys they had searched for, hoped for, and prayed for were gone. The house of horrors had swallowed them, and all that remained was a pursuit of justice for the lives that could never be restored. The arrest of John Wayne Gacy in December 1978 marked the beginning of what would soon be described as one of the most shocking trials in American criminal history. The suburban contractor who had once charmed neighbors, politicians, and business leaders was now unmasked as a serial killer whose crimes spanned years and claimed the lives of dozens of young men and boys. But in the world of the courtroom, it was not enough for investigators to have discovered the bodies or even to have extracted a confession. The justice system required the formal presentation of evidence, the testing of claims, and the difficult work of establishing guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The proceedings that followed were destined to be labeled the trial of the century, not only for the horror of the crimes, but for the questions they raised about sanity, responsibility, and the dark capacities of human nature. After his arrest, Gacy had alternated between cooperation and denial. At times he admitted to dozens of killings, detailing his grisly methods of strangulation and disposal. At other times he denied responsibility, insisting that other employees of his contracting business may have committed the murders without his knowledge. This erratic behavior complicated the work of prosecutors. The physical evidence was overwhelming. 29 bodies discovered under the floorboards and crawl spaces of his home, additional victims recovered from the Des Plaines River, and testimony from young men who had narrowly escaped his advances. Still, the law required that these facts be meticulously linked to Gacy himself in order to withstand the defense's attempts to create doubt. The trial began in February of 1980 in Cook County, Illinois, and from the very first day it drew massive public attention. Courtrooms were packed with journalists, sketch artists, and family members of victims. Television cameras lined the sidewalks outside, capturing images of a man who had once posed for photographs with local politicians and even visited the White House. Now he was paraded in handcuffs, his face expressionless as the state prepared to expose every detail of his private horrors. The prosecution strategy was straightforward: to prove that Gacy had personally lured, assaulted, murdered, and concealed the victims. They presented an array of evidence: photographs of the crawl space, physical items belonging to victims, and chilling testimony from survivors who had escaped his grasp. Some described being offered construction jobs or rides home, only to find themselves trapped in Gacy's house and subjected to his infamous rope trick, where he would tighten a ligature around a victim's neck under the guise of a magic act. Others testified to being handcuffed and assaulted, but managing to flee before the encounter turned fatal. Each story reinforced the same disturbing pattern: the deliberate targeting of vulnerable young men, the calculated use of charm and deception, and the sudden eruption of violence. Perhaps the most haunting testimony came from the experts who had examined the crawl space of Gacy's home. They described the stench of decay, the painstaking excavation of skeletal remains, and the difficulty of identifying victims who had been buried in shallow graves, often with multiple bodies layered together. Forensic specialists testified that many victims bore marks of strangulation or suffocation. The sheer number of remains discovered under one suburban residence was enough to shake the public's understanding of safety within their own neighborhoods. Faced with this mountain of evidence, Gacy's defense team turned to a strategy that has long fascinated and divided observers: the insanity defense. They did not deny that the killings had occurred, nor that Gacy had been connected to the crime scenes. Instead, they argued that he was legally insane at the time of the murders, unable to distinguish right from wrong, and therefore not fully responsible for his actions. To support this claim, They presented psychiatric experts who diagnosed him with multiple personality disorder, suggesting that an alternate personality, sometimes referred to as Jack or Bad Jack, committed the crimes while the public-facing Gacy remained unaware. This argument ignited fierce debate both inside and outside the courtroom. On one hand, the brutality and sheer scale of the crime seemed almost unimaginable for a rational mind. On the other, the prosecution countered with evidence of Gacy's meticulous planning, the way he built a specific system for a burial, the care he took to pour lime over bodies to mask odors, and his repeated ability to maintain a normal outward life while hiding his crimes. Prosecutors argued that such behavior demonstrated clear awareness of guilt and deliberate attempts to avoid detection. The trial became a battle of experts. Psychiatrists of the defense described a deeply disturbed man with violent impulses he could not control, while psychiatrists for the prosecution emphasized his calculated deception and ability to maintain employment relationships and a business empire while committing murder in secret. Ultimately, it was not just the testimony of experts, but the cumulative weight of survivor stories, physical evidence, and Gacy's own words that carried the greatest impact. Gacy himself sometimes undermined his defense by alternating between denial and bizarre admissions. In moments of arrogance, he claimed to be smarter than the police, boasting about how long it had taken him to discover his crimes. At other times, he painted himself as a victim, suggesting he was being framed or that the murders were exaggerated. Jurors were left to weigh not only the evidence, but the erratic personality of the man on trial. The prosecution's closing arguments were relentless. They reminded jurors that dozens of young lives had been cut short, that families had endured years of anguish wondering what had happened to their missing sons, and that the remains of those boys had been discovered in Gacy's own home. They emphasized that Gacy was not a man out of control, but a man who carefully concealed his acts for years, suggesting a chilling degree of rational calculation. When the case went to the jury, the public held its breath. The deliberations lasted only a short time, less than 2 hours. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming strength of the evidence. On March 13, 1980, John Wayne Gacy was found guilty of 33 counts of murder. The verdict was unanimous, and the court erupted with both relief and grief. Families of victims wept, reporters rushed to file stories, and the mask of the killer clown was permanently fixed in the public consciousness. The sentencing phase followed quickly, and here again the jury was decisive. The brutality of the crimes, the number of victims, and the lack of remorse weighed heavily. Gacy was sentenced to death for 12 of the murders, the maximum under Illinois law, and given life sentences for the remaining counts. Judge Louis Garippo made it clear that society had no place for such a predator, declaring that the crimes defied comprehension and demanded the ultimate punishment. The trial of John Wayne Gacy thus entered the history books not only as one of the most notorious prosecutions of the 20th century, but also as a chilling reminder of how ordinary appearances can conceal monstrous realities. The verdict brought a measure of justice to families who had lost their sons, though no sentence could fully erase their pain. For the public, the case reinforced both a fascination with the psychology of killers and renewed awareness of the vulnerabilities in everyday life. When John Wayne Gacy was sentenced to death in 1980, the case had already etched itself into American consciousness as one of the most disturbing criminal sagas in modern history. The sheer scale of his crimes, the grotesque method of concealment, and the shocking duality of his public image left an indelible mark on the cultural imagination. But the years following his conviction would extend his infamy, as Gacy lived on death row for nearly 14 years before his execution, using that time to shape his own narrative, create art, and continue unsettling the nation. His final years, his execution, and the legacy that followed reveal much about how society grapples with a memory of extreme evil. Gacy was transferred to Menard Correctional Center in Illinois, where he spent the majority of his time on death row. Unlike the brief and chaotic period leading up to his trial, death row was marked by long stretches of waiting, appeals, and media attention. Gacy, ever the manipulator, used his time to grant interviews, maintain contact with the outside world, and even attempt to redefine how people remembered him. He denied his guilt repeatedly, often insisting he was a victim of a grand conspiracy or that the young men had died accidentally. In interviews, he would downplay the horrifying details of his crimes, claiming he was misunderstood or unfairly demonized by the press. What disturbed many was how comfortable Gacy seemed in his role as a convicted killer. Instead of retreating into silence, he actively sought out attention. He corresponded with journalists, spoke to college students, and even gave a series of high-profile interviews. Each time, he displayed the same chilling composure and arrogance that had characterized him throughout his trial. He rarely showed remorse. If anything, he relished the notoriety. For victims' families, this was a source of deep pain, as Gacy's words often felt like a continuation of his cruelty, reminding them again and again of the loved ones he had taken from them. During his years behind bars, Gacy developed an unexpected and controversial pastime: painting. Using simple art supplies provided to him, he created hundreds of paintings, many of which reflected his fascination with clowns. Some were self-portraits of his alter ego, Pogo the Clown, while others depicted cartoon characters, skulls, or abstract designs. The paintings quickly became infamous, and collectors on the outside purchased them at high prices, driven by a morbid curiosity. For critics, this commercialization of Gacy's art was appalling, an exploitation of tragedy and a glorification of a killer who had already caused immeasurable suffering. Yet, whether people despised or desired his artwork, the fact that it existed kept Gacy's name alive in cultural conversations. Exhibits were sometimes organized to display the paintings, often sparking outrage from victims' families who felt their children's memory was being overshadowed by the killer's bizarre legacy. For others, the paintings symbolized the incomprehensible duality of Gacy's personality: a man who could smile in a clown suit at a charity event and then commit atrocities in the privacy of his home. The art became another unsettling reminder of the mask Gacy had worn for so long. As his execution date approached in the early 1990s, media coverage intensified once again. Reporters revisited the case, documentaries explored the details, and television specials reminded the public of the horror that had unfolded in suburban Chicago 2 decades earlier. For many Americans, Gacy had become more than just a killer. He was a symbol of hidden evil lurking in plain sight. The fact that he had been a respected community member, even performing as a clown for children, made his story particularly chilling. He embodied the fear that monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they smile, shake hands, and live next door. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center. In the hours leading up to his death, he reportedly ate a final meal consisting of fried chicken, French fries, Coca-Cola, and strawberries. True to form, he maintained his defiance until the very end. His final words were reported as, "Kiss my ass." With those words, he left the world much as he had lived in it, mocking, unrepentant, and devoid of any acknowledgement of the lives he had destroyed. The execution brought a measure of closure to some families, but it did not erase the trauma or the grief. For many, the years of appeals and the attention Gacy continued to receive on death row had prolonged their suffering. Some attended the execution to witness his final moments, while others avoided altogether, finding little comfort in his death. The execution also reignited national debates about the death penalty, with some seeing it as justice served and others questioning whether allowing Gacy to live for so long on death row had truly served the interests of justice. In the years since his execution, Gacy's legacy has remained both haunting and complex. He has been the subject of countless documentaries, books, and dramatizations. True crime enthusiasts study his life and crimes as a case study in manipulation, deceit, and psychopathy. Law enforcement agencies have also used the case as a reminder of the importance of thorough investigations and the need to take missing persons cases seriously, something that was often lacking in the 1970s. Especially when the victims were young men. For the families of the victims, remembrance has been the most important part of the legacy. Memorials and vigils have honored the young men whose lives were stolen, ensuring they are remembered as individuals rather than as statistics in a horrifying tally. The names and faces of the victims remind the world that behind every true crime story lies profound human loss. Gacy's case may become a cultural phenomenon, but for those who knew the victims, the pain remains personal and enduring. The case has also left a broader cultural imprint. The very image of the killer clown became a lasting symbol in American folklore, influencing horror films, novels, and urban legends. Although Gacy was not the first person to wear clown makeup, his crimes forever changed how many people viewed the clown figure. What was once associated with innocence and laughter now carried undertones of fear and suspicion. Popular culture. From Stephen King's to countless television shows, borrowed from the Gacy legacy to craft villains that reflected society's deepest fears. But perhaps the most sobering legacy of John Wayne Gacy is not the art, the interviews, or the cultural references. It is a reminder of how evil can disguise itself so effectively. His crimes forced communities to reconsider what they thought they knew about safety, trust, and appearances. They serve as a warning that predators often hide in plain sight, shielded by charm, position, or reputation. Decades after his death, John Wayne Gacy remains a name that evokes horror, revulsion, and grim fascination. Yet, while his story continues to be told, the truest legacy belongs not to him but to his victims. They were sons, brothers, friends, young men with futures that were stolen. Remembering them ensures that the narrative does not glorify the killer, but instead honors a humanity that was lost. In the end, Gacy's reign of terror ended on a prison gurney, but the echoes of his crimes continue to shape how society remembers, mourns, and learns from the darkest chapters of its past. That concludes the story of John Wayne Gacy, one of the most disturbing and infamous serial killers in American history. His crimes serve as a chilling reminder of how evil can hide behind a mask of normalcy, and why it's so important to stay vigilant and demand justice for victims who can no longer speak for themselves. If you found this documentary informative, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell, so you never miss another deep dive into real crime stories. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Gacy could have been stopped earlier if red flags weren't ignored? Share your opinion in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and always remember, truth leaves no shadows.